He lifted a drain cover at the side of the house to discover a gluttonous flesh-like substance blocking everything. And who was there to see what was going on? Dennis, of course. Spill the TXC. If you've watched any of my previous podcast episodes, you will know that I choose a topic and then I read multiple stories that fall under that category. Well, today's episode is slightly different. Because I chose a really simple topic, I thought I would leave it wide open for myself and just go with serial killers. Because there's so many serial killers to choose from. So I did my research. I found some really interesting cases and I shortlisted them. And then I was going through my list, going to choose my top ones. And then I stumbled across a very specific serial killer. This serial killer story shook me to my core, and the deeper I fell into this case, the more I needed to know, because the details felt surreal. It felt like I was reading the plot of the scariest horror movie of the century. It didn't feel like this could be somebody's reality. This true crime story is so detailed, so involved, so horrific and harrowing that I needed to do a whole episode on what the press would come to call the Muswell Hill murderer. Welcome back to Spill the TXC with me, your host, Amber. Grab a cup of tea and turn down the lights as we delve into the life, crime, psychology, and finally the capture of Dennis Andrew Nilsen. Now, I want to take you all the way back to Dennis's childhood because some therapists have blamed Dennis's behaviour and his killings on his childhood. And having done my research, I've made up my own mind on whether his childhood is to blame. And before I give my opinion, I just want to know what you guys think. So let's start there. In 1942, Dennis's mum and dad got married after only knowing each other a few months. They moved straight in with her mum and dad, so Dennis's maternal grandparents. Bear in mind, Dennis isn't born yet. They moved straight in with his maternal grandparents and they never moved back out again. His dad worked for Free Norwegian Forces, and that through and through was his priority. Not his family, not ever his family. So he was barely ever there. Even when all three kids were born, he was barely ever there. He would come back, sleep with his wife, get her pregnant, and then piss off again. So then we get to the 23rd of November, 1945. And just a fun fact, that is the day after my birthday. But we are different star signs, so obviously we're completely different people. But actually on my birthday, on the 22nd of November, you're on the cusp, or I'm on the cusp. And that means I get the privilege of being able to choose whether I want to be a Scorpio or a Sagittarius. And now finding out that Dennis is a Sagittarius, I'm choosing Scorpio. So the 23rd of November, 1945, Dennis is born, and he's the middle child. And they are still living at his mum's mum and dad, his maternal grandparents, because his dad doesn't care to come and get them a house. His dad doesn't care to live with them. All he cares about is his job and coming back for the occasional romp. So Dennis didn't have his father figure, although he did have his granddad, who he was extremely close to. And according to statements, Dennis could never show love to other family members. He could only show it to his granddad, and he had such a close bond with him. And his granddad, in my opinion, is the person who gave him a normal childhood because he gave him love back. And obviously there was something not quite right with Dennis because he wasn't able to show love to anybody else. But the fact that he was able to show love to his granddad says a lot. He also had pets. And he never harmed them. And that's the number one thing therapists look out for when children are dangerous, or to indicate that children are dangerous. But anyway, his granddad gave him a normal childhood. Dennis would talk about how his family would take him out for picnics, how he would go for hikes along the pier on his granddad's shoulders, how his granddad would take him fishing. His granddad was a fisherman, that was his job. Dennis actually describes this time in his life, his childhood, as content. He felt extremely content. And when questioned about his granddad, he described him as his great hero and protector. He also said that when his granddad was out at sea, life would be empty and he would just wait for his granddad to return. On one occasion when his granddad was working out at sea, he actually died of a heart attack. And when news got home and his granddad was brought home, Dennis arrived home from school one day and his mum said to him, "Your granddad's home, do you want to see him?" Bear in mind, Dennis knew nothing. He did not know that his granddad had died. So he was excited thinking, "Oh my God, granddad's back." That's what he lived for, his granddad coming home from sea. So he said, "Yes, where is he?" And his mum said he's in the front room. So he burst into that front room to see his granddad lying in an open casket. And that's how he found out his granddad had died. That is enough to F a child up. But to the point of where he got to, I'm not sure. In 1948, his parents got divorced. And then his mum remarried a man called Andrew Scott, and in 4 years had 4 more children. And Dennis absolutely resented the fact that all of his younger siblings and his older brother got so much more attention than him. I mean, for the adults in his family, they couldn't get anything from him. They would try, well, they tried when he was younger, but he wasn't capable of showing affection or love or empathy to any of these people, only his granddad. So they just stopped trying. And I'm not saying that's right, because you never stop trying with your children. They just gave up with him. And then he lost his granddad, and he became so quiet and reserved, and he used to spend hours just standing at the harbour staring out to sea, just thinking, just alone. And then in 1954, Dennis was out at sea himself, and he actually nearly drowned. And when he recalled this event, he said at first he was panicked and thrashing about the water, but then he thought about his granddad, and he felt serene and tranquil. And then he thought, just let it happen. But another boy his age actually pulled him out and saved him. Now, I don't know if he was happy to just let himself drown because he missed his granddad so much, or because he was so unhappy with his life, which he felt was poor and cramped. He wanted out. And to make things even worse and even harder for Dennis, when he hit his teens, he realized he was gay, and he felt like he could tell nobody. But this is where things take a real sinister turn. You see, his little sister, he thought had the same facial structure as a boy that he fancied in school. And obviously he couldn't tell anybody that he fancied this boy. He could never tell the boy himself. But he used to look at his sister and imagine that she was the boy. They had similar features. And then he started to essay her when she was asleep. And then one night he decided to do the same to his brother, because he wasn't feeling fulfilled with his sister. She didn't have the right parts. So he did it to his older brother, except his brother woke up. He woke up and he caught Dennis in the act. And then the next day, in front of all of their friends, in front of all of their school friends, he outed Dennis. He called him gay. He called him hen, which is Scottish slang for girl. And Dennis hated him for that. So at 14, Dennis decided to join the Army Cadet Force to escape his family, mainly his brother. And this is where Dennis truly found alcohol. The army trained him to become a chef, and in 1961 he was enlisted for 9 years. And he described the 3 years he spent training to become a chef as the happiest of his life. He would describe himself and his colleagues as a hard-working, boozy lot. But his colleagues actually had a different view of that. They said that he drank a hell of a lot more than the rest of them. They said they thought it was to compensate for his shyness, to bring him out of it, so they never really questioned it until he started doing really strange things. On occasions, he would pretend to be drunk. He hadn't drunk anything, but he would pretend to be drunk and pretend to have passed out naked. And we later find out from police statements from Dennis himself that he would lay there for hours, waiting and hoping for a colleague to SA him. And one night, him and a colleague got absolutely obliterated. They did drink this night, and he did drink most nights. This was just on occasion. He would pretend to be drunk, pretend to be passed out. But on this particular night, him and a colleague got absolutely obliterated. They drank themselves into a stupor. And that was the night he realized that although he didn't, he could have done anything, because of how vulnerable his colleague was. And that fueled some fantasies for him. The thought of somebody being so vulnerable, so drunk that they couldn't even fight back. He would never shower with the rest of his colleagues because he was scared he'd get an erection in front of them. So he'd always have to do it secretly after all of them, because he didn't want anyone to know that he was gay. And he even once paid for sex with a prostitute, just so that he could come and brag to his colleagues, but later stated that he actually thought it was overrated and depressing. And a really poignant thing that happened to him whilst he was in the army, something that really changed the way he thought and really fueled those fantasies even more, is he got captured by an Arab taxi driver. This taxi driver beat him unconscious and stuffed him into the boot of his car. And then whenever he got to where he was going to, he dragged Dennis out of the boot of his car, at which point Dennis came around. He grabbed a jack handle and beat the taxi driver unconscious. He then stuffed the taxi driver into the boot of his car and found it so arousing that that would be what he would masturbate over for years to come. Dennis ended his military career at the rank of corporal in 1971. And doesn't that just emphasize the fact that just because somebody's got an important job doesn't mean they're a trustworthy person? Shortly before he started acting out his sick fantasies, he would do things like stand in front of a freestanding mirror and angle it so that he couldn't see his own head. He would then masturbate, and because he couldn't see his own head, he could pretend that he was doing the deed with another man. And he would later explain that by doing this, it would allow him to split his personality into the domineering and the passive partner. And he enjoyed both. He would also masturbate to a 19th century oil painting called The Raft of the Medusa, which was a painting of an old man holding the limp, lifeless, naked body of a younger man, whilst he sits next to the dismembered body of another younger man. In 1972, Dennis fell on hard times. He couldn't afford to live out by himself anymore, so he had to move back home with his mum, who was constantly on at him to find somebody, to settle down, to start a family. This was the last thing Dennis wanted to do. And one night he was with his brother, his older brother, and his partner, and another couple, and they were watching a documentary on gay rights. And at the end of the documentary, Dennis was the only one who actually spoke up for gay rights, which his brother hated because they were so against being gay. This resulted in them having a fight and his brother going to the rest of the family and telling all of them that Dennis is gay. And that was the last time Dennis ever spoke to his brother. He cut all contact from that night. And then in December 1972, he joined the Met Police. Just let that sink in. This psychotic murderer to be joined the Met Police. These are the people we trust more than anybody. He moved to London and pretty much cut contact with the rest of his family. He would sporadically, very, very sporadically, write to his mum and his younger siblings, but it wasn't often at all. And then in the summer of 1973, he started frequenting gay bars and he started to meet people who were like him, and this opened so many doors for him. He would start bringing men back. He would start acting out fantasies. He would sleep with them, but they would always leave in the morning, and that left Dennis feeling like he had lent them his body. And then we get to 1975, where Dennis witnesses a 20-year-old man, a young 20-year-old man called David Gallican. He was being threatened outside of a pub, so Dennis intervened. He saved David, and David was so thankful and ended up going back to Dennis's flat with him, where they continued drinking for the rest of the night. And David divulged that he's also gay and he's living in a hostel and he's got nowhere to go. And by morning, they had agreed to live together. And Dennis wasted no time. That very next day, he was on the hunt for a bigger apartment. He wanted this to happen then and there. He was so excited to have a companion. And that's when he stumbled across 195 Melrose Avenue. His dad had recently died and he had left him £1,000 inheritance money, which in today's terms would be £10,000. So Dennis used that money to put a down payment on the apartment and also negotiated with the landlord that him and David were the only ones who get to use the garden. They had sole use of the garden, and because he had a bit of money, the landlord said, yes, that's fine, let's do it. So they moved in very, very quickly, and they actually got into a relationship very quickly. They was in a full-blown relationship within days of meeting each other. But it wasn't long before the cracks started to show, because Dennis was verbally abusive to David, and David hated that. They quickly started sleeping in separate rooms, and they were even bringing different men home. And I think Dennis just never said anything because he was happy to have David there when he didn't have anyone else there. In the nights when he couldn't bring another man home, when David hadn't brought another man home, he still had David there. Dennis needed somebody. He couldn't stand his own company. But then in May 1977, David left and Dennis was left alone. And then over the next 18 months, Dennis had multiple very brief relationships, lasting only a few weeks each. And one thing became painfully clear to him. No one ever stayed. But what if he could make them stay? That leads us to Dennis's first victim, Stephen Holmes, who was only 14 years old. It was the 30th of December 1978, and Stephen was trying to buy alcohol, but he was 14, so of course he was unsuccessful. In steps Dennis, with the promise of more alcohol back at his flat. The next morning, Dennis woke up early, and he just stared at Stephen. He was so scared that Stephen would leave when he woke up, so he decided he wasn't going to wake him up. He straddled Stephen. He strangled him, close to the point of death, and then he drowned him in a bucket of water to finish the job. Dennis then performed a ritual for the first time, which he would go on to do after every single kill. He put Stephen in the bath. He bathed him. He shaved every hair from his body. He got him out the bath. He dried him. He laid him on the bed. He caressed his body. He sat on Stephen's chest and masturbated over him. And then he laid down next to Stephen's dead body and fell to sleep. And the next morning, he decided to rip up his carpet, pull back the floorboards, and put Stephen in his new bed because he wasn't ready to let him go. He killed Stephen on the 30th of December 1978 and kept him under his floorboards until the 11th of August 1979. And the only reason he had to take him out then because Stephen's body was rotting. It was decomposing and it smelt. So Dennis decided the way to get rid of this body was to burn it in the garden that only he was allowed in. So he dismembered the body. He took it outside bit by bit, and he placed a tire on top to disguise the smell. And then he invited the children from the neighborhood over to watch the bonfire. How exciting. They had no idea that they were watching the body of Stephen Holmes burn. His next victim was Andrew Ho, and it was the 11th of October, 1979. He met Andrew in a pub. Andrew was a student. And he promised Andrew a hot meal and a bed for the night, and Andrew said yes. He was a student. He didn't have much money of his own. So they went back. And whilst they were doing the deed, Dennis attempted to strangle Andrew. But Andrew was too strong for Dennis. Or not as inebriated as the rest, I guess. He fought back and he escaped and he called the police, and for some unknown reason, he never pressed charges, which left Dennis free to find Kenneth Ockenden on the 3rd of December 1979. Kenneth was a 23-year-old tourist visiting family in the UK from Canada. They met in a pub, and when Dennis found out that Kenneth was a tourist, he offered to show him all of the landmarks around London, and of course Kenneth said yes because that's what he was here for. And then Dennis offered him a bed and a hot meal, and Kenneth said yes to that as well because he didn't have much money. This is what Dennis did. He preyed on the weak and the vulnerable, people who needed help. And Kenneth needed help. He needed a place to stay. So Kenneth went back with Dennis. And they were drinking whiskey and rum and beer. And Dennis put some headphones on Kenneth and said to him, listen to this song, listen to my music. So Kenneth did. He was sitting there listening to the music with the headphones on. And then Dennis strangled him with the cord of the same headphones. He dragged him across the floor with that cord. And then when it was done, Dennis poured himself a large glass of rum and listened to some music with those same headphones. He then performed his ritual and put Kenneth on the bed and fell asleep next to him. And the next morning he went straight out to buy a Polaroid camera so that he could come back and take pictures of Kenneth in suggestive positions. He then put Kenneth's body under the floorboards in his new bed, but got him out regularly over the next few weeks to lay him on the bed, to sit him on the armchair until rigor mortis set in. And to keep him company, they would watch TV together. Ish. Then we get to the 17th of May 1980, when Dennis meets Martin Duffy. Now this one's really sad. I mean, they're all really sad. We've had a 14-year-old, of course they're all really sad, but this one is really sad. See, Martin was 16 years old, and he had hitchhiked to London without his parents knowing because he was being questioned by the British Transport Police for avoiding his train fare. He didn't want to go home to his parents because he didn't pay for a train ticket. And what ended up happening to him was he'd been sleeping rough for 4 days. That was what he chose rather than going home to his parents and admitting what he had done. He'd been sleeping rough, and Dennis found him, of all people. He offered him, as he did, a place to stay, a warm meal. And Martin said yes. He was desperate by that point. When they got back to Dennis's flat, Martin fell straight to sleep. He was knackered. This poor boy. Dennis didn't even let him make it through the night. He strangled him till he was close to the point of death, and then he dragged him over to his kitchen sink and drowned him. And then he did his sick ritual. And then once he had put Martin back on his bed, he kissed, caressed, complimented, and masturbated over Martin's dead body. He stored him in a cupboard as he liked to with all of his bodies for as long as he possibly could. But after just 2 days, he noticed that Martin was bloating. So he stuffed him under the floorboards. By the end of that year, he had killed 5 more victims and attempted to kill a 6th, but only one of them could be identified. How is it that to this day, we still don't know all of Dennis's victims? There are still people who never got the justice of having their names said in court for what he did to them. They just kind of went unnoticed. Next in line was William Sutherland, who was 26 years old. William's death was in quick succession with the others. 5 in just a few weeks, 5 murders. And by this point, Dennis had quite a few bodies under his floorboards, and he noticed they were attracting insects and that the foul smell was coming out of just the property that he lived in. People could smell it down the road. So he decided to burn all 5 bodies in a bonfire in his garden, disguised by the smell of tires that he would throw on. And once again, he let the children from the neighbourhood come and watch. By February 1981, which is just 1 month later, Dennis had killed 4 more people. He had taken 4 more innocent lives in the space of a month. And he didn't even know their names. He would call them things such as Blue Eyes or Belfast Boy or English Skinhead. He didn't even know their names. And that's why some of these people can't even be identified. Years later down the line, in a police statement, Dennis casually reflected, "End of the day, end of the drink, end of a person. Floorboards back, carpet replaced, and back to work at Denmark Street." After a couple months' break, Dennis then met Malcolm Barlow, who was 23 years old. Now, Malcolm was just leaning against the wall of Dennis's property where he lived. And when Dennis asked what was wrong, Malcolm had weak legs from his epilepsy medication. I mean, what I'm about to tell you literally makes no sense. Dennis then invites Malcolm up to his flat, so Malcolm goes, and Dennis calls Malcolm an ambulance, which picks him up, takes him to the hospital, makes him better. And then the next day, Malcolm returns to thank Dennis. And Dennis offers Malcolm up for dinner and drinks, to which he says yes. Because Dennis is a good guy, he's a nice guy. He saved Malcolm. He called the ambulance. Malcolm had a lot to drink that night and ended up falling asleep. And of course, Dennis strangled him, drowned him, and then stuffed his body under the kitchen sink. But now Dennis had a problem, because his landlord gave him notice. He wanted to renovate the place, but he couldn't just throw him out. Dennis had to agree to this, and Dennis wasn't agreeing. For obvious reasons, he's got bodies and limbs and organs here, there, and everywhere. So he says no. And I can imagine the landlord probably just wanted Dennis out because of the foul smell that was coming from his place. But he couldn't say that, could he? So he ended up offering Dennis £1,000, which in today's currency would be £10,000. That's how desperate he was for Dennis to leave. And Dennis agreed at the thought of that money, so he took the £1,000 and he left. And on the 4th of October 1981, which was the day before he left Melrose Avenue, he had his final bonfire to burn the last 5 victims that he had killed there, after dissecting them, cutting up their organs and flushing them down the toilet, of course. So now Dennis is in his attic flat in Cranley Gardens, where he's got no garden for bonfires. He can't hide bodies under the floorboards because there are people that live beneath him. He needs a new plan. So for the first 2 months, he didn't harm any man that he brought back. They all got to walk out alive. Until the 23rd of November, when he brought back Paul Nobbs. He tried to strangle him, but Paul overpowered him and escaped. I guess you could call that a birthday treat gone wrong. And then just a few months later, in March 1982, he met John Howlett. Dennis met John in a pub in Leicester Square, and they decided to go back to Dennis's attic flat to carry on drinking. When John passed out, Dennis tried to arouse him, but he wasn't successful. So he just sat there staring at him, drinking rum, before deciding to strangle him. But John woke up, and he fought back. He fought for his life. But because he was so inebriated, Dennis overpowered him, and he strangled him, and he thought he killed him. But minutes later, John started breathing again. So Dennis strangled him for a second time. This repeated 3 times. And John kept coming back. He kept fighting for his life until finally, Dennis dragged him to the bath and drowned what was left of his consciousness. For over a week, Dennis walked around with John's finger impressions on his own neck. And nobody noticed a thing. This next one is going to absolutely blow your mind because it doesn't make sense with his pattern. It doesn't make sense with his behaviour. In May 1982, Dennis met Carl Stoter. Dennis met Carl at the Black Cap in London, and Carl was depressed. He had just come out of a long-term relationship that he didn't want to end, and Dennis took advantage of this vulnerability. He invited him back. Carl obviously said yes, and after drinking and passing out, Dennis strangled him and took no chances. He didn't wait for him to wake up like the one before. He took him straight to the bath and he drowned him. But Carl didn't die. Carl was somehow, after all of that, still alive. And then Dennis did something that, I couldn't have called it. He started rubbing Carl's limbs, rubbing his heart to increase circulation. And when Carl actually did come back round, with a banging headache and not having a clue what happened, because it all happened while he was asleep, he didn't know what Dennis had done. Dennis told him that he got tangled in the zip of the sleeping bag and he suffocated, and Dennis saved him, saved his life. And Carl was so thankful because he believed him. Somehow, Dennis let Carl walk out of his flat the next day. Now, unfortunately, Dennis's next victim wasn't so lucky. In June 1982, Dennis met Graham Allen, who was 27 years old. Graham was attempting to hail a taxi in Shaftesbury Avenue when Dennis saw him, and he set his sights, didn't he? The two got talking, and Dennis offered to take him for dinner in Cranley Gardens, and Graham said yes. And the next morning, whilst Graham was eating an omelette made by Dennis, Dennis strangled him, left him in his bathtub for 3 days, and then dissected him on his kitchen floor, and then took a 6-month break. And that leads us to the 26th of January 1983 and to Dennis's final victim, Stephen Sinclair. Stephen was just 20 years old and was extremely vulnerable. He had bandages on his wrists from suicide attempts, and you can bet your bottom dollar that Dennis noticed. And that's probably the reason he chose Stephen, because he could see the vulnerability. He could see the desperation, and he knew what numbed the pain for people like this. Alcohol. So he offered Stephen back with the promise of more alcohol, and Stephen said yes. And they drank so much that Stephen ended up passing out in a drunken stupor. And at that point, Dennis knelt before Stephen and said, "Oh, Stephen, here I go again." And then he strangled him with a necktie and a rope, just to make sure. And then after his normal ritual, he laid Stephen on the bed and smothered him in talcum powder. He then arranged 3 mirrors around the bed so that he could see things from all angles. And then he got naked and laid next to Stephen's naked body for hours before turning Stephen's head, kissing him on the forehead and falling asleep next to him. The next morning he got to work disposing of Stephen's body promptly, because he didn't have anywhere to hide them anymore. He would dissect them on his kitchen floor. He would cut up the skin and the organs and the tiny bones, like finger bones, and he would flush them down the toilet. And he would then boil. It's awful to even say. It's hard to say. He would boil the skull, the hands and the feet to get rid of the rest of the flesh, because apparently it was a lot harder to remove the flesh from those places. And then he would just dump them wherever he could, anywhere that wouldn't report back to him. Now, on the 4th of February 1983, This is where everything changed. And it was all Dennis's fault. He may as well have walked into a police station and said, "This is what I did, arrest me." He wrote to the estate agents complaining that the drains in his building were blocked. So on the 8th of February, a plumber called Michael Catran, who was employed by a company called Dino Rod, he turned up to check the drains. He lifted a drain cover at the side of the house to discover a gluttonous flesh-like substance blocking everything. And who was there to see what was going on? Dennis, of course. So Michael shows Dennis the drain and he said, look what's blocking these drains. I've never seen anything like it. It looks like an animal. And Dennis has a look down there and he says, "Looks like somebody's been flushing their Kentucky Fried Chicken to me." But Michael's not happy with this, so he calls his supervisor. But his supervisor's very busy for the day. So he says, "Look, let's meet back there in the morning and we'll have a look. We'll have a look together." So Michael says, "Okay, fine. I'll meet you back here in the morning." The next morning comes. They turn up. First thing, it was the first job on their list. And would you believe when they lift that drain cover, it's clear. The drains aren't blocked anymore. That gluttonous flesh-like substance that was down there has gone. Thank goodness these two men found that instantly suspicious, because what Michael had described wouldn't just disappear, wouldn't just filter through itself. So they were very suspicious. So without telling anybody, they started checking some of the other pipes. Michael finds some flesh and 4 small bones in a pipe that's connected to a drain that leads from the top flat of the house. That's the only flat that particular drain leads from. So they call the police. They still think there's a chance that this could be an animal, but even so, they call the police. So the police turn up, but nobody from the flats, nobody who lives there knows just yet, because it's not an official investigation. So they take the flesh and the bones and they send it off to a mortuary in Hornsey. And days later, pathologist David Bowen confirms it's human remains. So now DCI Peter J and 2 of his colleagues, they turn up back at Cranley Gardens and they wait. They wait for Dennis to return home from work, which, by the way, he's a civil servant now. He left the Met and he's now a civil servant. So they're standing there, they're waiting for him to get home. And when he does arrive home, DCI Peter J introduces himself and says, "We need to come up to your flat and talk to you." And in a statement that Peter made, he said that Dennis smirked as he replied back to him, "Since when are the police interested in my drains?" Apparently, he then asked if Peter's colleagues were health inspectors, to which Peter said no, they're policemen as well. And then Dennis just led them straight up to his flat. No arguing, no pushback, he just led the way. So once they were inside the flat, Peter said the smell of rotting flesh was all-consuming. And the 3 of them in that moment decided they were not about to go searching through this flat. They needed to take Dennis down to the station and they needed to send people back to search the flat to find the body, but they were not about to do that themselves right now with him there. So Peter turned to Dennis and he said, "Where's the rest of the body?" And very casually, Dennis said, "In the wardrobe." And Peter said in his mind, it was one body. He didn't even consider that it could have been more. But one of his colleagues, whilst they was in the police car, turned to Dennis and said, "Dennis, is it 1 or 2? And Dennis said, 15. Since 1978. The remains were retrieved from the wardrobe, from a tea chest in the living room, an upturned drawer in the bathroom, and under the kitchen sink. And by the 11th of February, Dennis's mum had provided pictures of Dennis to the Daily Mirror. They had been contacted her because they was notified by Michael Catran, you remember the plumber? And on that day, Dennis was the front page of the Daily Mirror. And on the same day, he was charged at 5:40 p.m. And when he was asked why he killed, why he murdered all of these people, all he said back was, "I was hoping you could tell me that." He described his victims as a prop in his fantasies and said, "I wish I could stop, but I couldn't. I had no other thrill or happiness." He said he took no pleasure from the act, but just worshipped the art and the act of death itself. He was given life with a minimum of 25 years. He was sent to HMP Wormwood, where he was attacked by another inmate, Albert Moffat. Albert sliced Dennis's face and chest with a razor, resulting in 89 stitches. And then Dennis got transferred to HMP Full Sutton, as a vulnerable prisoner. They were concerned for his safety and they gave him extra protection. Thankfully, in 1994, his 25-year minimum sentence was replaced with a whole life tariff, which is what he should have got in the first place, because this ensured that he would be spending the rest of his life behind bars. Although he did spend the rest of his life receiving extra security and extra protection for his own safety. He ended up dying during surgery on an abdominal aneurysm because he got a pulmonary embolism and hemorrhaged. And apparently, that is severely painful. The therapists have stated that his detachment and his attachment of love and death comes from his childhood. And I can definitely see how certain things that happened in his childhood could have affected him in his adult years. But the way I read it, these therapists depict a crazy person. But to me, he was controlled, calculated, and disturbingly calm. He used everyday normal things to gain the trust of his victims. A hot meal, a bed, alcohol, music. There was always music. And on one account where a potential victim overpowered Dennis and ended up escaping, Dennis was screaming at the victim, "Take all my money, take all of it, take it," as if that was a repayment for what he was about to do, a kind of sorry. That's not psychotic, is it? That's panic. That's somebody with full awareness. Somebody who knew exactly what he was doing and somebody who tried to get out of it. That to me is somebody with full awareness. Somebody who knew exactly what he was doing. And in those times where he'd just moved to Cranley Gardens and he needed a new plan because he couldn't hide the bodies under the floorboards. He didn't have a garden to burn them in. He refrained. He had men back to the flat. And he made the choice to not harm them. That's somebody in control. And where was the justice in him being awarded security and extra protection when he was in prison? When every single one of his victims had no security, no one to come and save them, and no protection from the murderer that is Dennis Andrew Nilsen.